With the fall of Nazi Germany right on schedule, Stalin officially announced to the world that Hitler had escaped. U.S. and British spin doctors quickly changed the story, claiming that Hitler had committed suicide and that his body had been burned beyond recognition by his own officers. The key words are beyond recognition. While people were busy celebrating the end of World War II and believing what they wanted to believe, the international banksters who had sponsored the genocide, torture, and suffering of non-ethnic Jews stole their wealth from Swiss bank accounts just as they had stolen the wealth of the Russian czars after financing the Russian Revolution. The Vatican was also tied to plundering Nazi gold, which had been stolen from the Jews. It is a well-documented fact that Pope Pius XII lent his support to the anti-Semitic Hitler and his Nazi regime. With the fall of Nazi Germany, the Rothschilds wasted no time waving their Balfour Declaration at the British government and reminding them of their written promise to give them Palestine. But how could the British promise the Arab land of Palestine to the Jews? In 1917, the British parachuted free opium and hashish to the Turkish troops and stole Palestine from them.
One ingenious strategy was to parachute hashish and opium to the Turkish troops to try to keep their minds off the fighting. Allenby's strategy worked brilliantly.
During World War II, the British needed Arab oil and signed an agreement with the Arabs which forbid Jewish immigration into Palestine. Then at the end of the war, the British broke their agreement with the Arabs and allowed the Rothschild Jewish Zionists to smuggle hundreds of thousands of Jews from around the world into Palestine. To win public support, the Rothschilds, who owned Reuters and the Associated Press, bombarded their media empire with images of homeless Jewish Holocaust refugees crowded together in ships off the coast of Palestine. On October 24, 1945, the bankster pirates gave birth to their most powerful weapon of global control, the United Nations. According to plan, the British pulled out of Palestine and gave the land to the Jewish Zionists. These Zionist extremists call themselves God's chosen race of people and believe they have a God-given right to the land of the Palestinians. It is important to know that the land now called Israel was originally called Canaan in ancient times. Canaan was populated by the Canaanite people, who were the ancestors of today's Palestinians imprisoned in refugee camps in Israel. About 3,500 years ago, the Semitic Hyksos kings ruled Egypt for 100 years, but were expelled from Egypt into Canaan. The Egyptians called these Hyksos people the Habarus, which means Hebrews. These expelled Hebrews invaded and conquered the land of Canaan and changed the name of the land from Canaan to Israel. In 135 AD, the name was once again changed to Palestine after the Romans conquered the land. In 1948, the bankster-controlled United Nations officially turned Palestine into the Zionist state of Israel. To deal with the millions of Palestinian residents, the Israeli Jews massacred and drove them from their villages and homeland. The Jews herded the Palestinians into two separated regions called the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. The Rothschilds soon began financing Jewish Holocaust refugees to build illegal Jewish settlements on Palestinian land. These illegal Jewish settlements set the stage for Israel's Prime Minister Ariel Sharon's reign of terror against Palestinians who dared to defend what was left of their stolen homeland. Like Saddam Hussein, Sharon violated dozens of UN resolutions by using hundreds of tanks and American-supplied gunships and planes in an unrelenting campaign of bombing, murdering, bulldozing, starving, and terrorizing the Palestinians off of what remained of their land. In violation of international law, Israel also secretly developed over 100 nuclear weapons of mass destruction capable of vaporizing the entire Middle East. Defenseless against Israel's U.S.-backed military and media campaign, the Palestinian Muslims fought back with sticks and stones and suicide as their only means of defense against the wholesale theft of their ancient homeland. The story of the Bible was written by Hebrew Jews, who tell us that the Hebrew Jews are God's chosen race of people. Bible prophecy predicts that they will one day rule the world from their temple throne in Jerusalem, and that the world's King of Kings will be a descendant of King David and King Solomon of Israel. That is what Bible believers all over the world believe will come to pass. To turn this Bible prophecy into a reality would demand the cooperation of world leaders. It would also mean building a third temple in Jerusalem over the ancient ruins of King Solomon's temple. But there is one giant-sized problem. A sacred Muslim shrine called Dome of the Rock was already built on top of the ruins of Solomon's temple in the 7th century. It still stands majestically today in the heart of Jerusalem, and it would have to be destroyed. Since Israel is surrounded by not-so-friendly Muslim nations, and with millions of Muslim Palestinians living in Israel's West Bank and Gaza Strip, this Bible prophecy is impossible to fulfill. Or is it? Like a screenplay for a movie, the Bible story was written by Hebrew Jews. But who is the director and the producer? Is it God? Or is it a special interest group of the world's wealthiest men? The Rothschilds, whose friend companies had helped finance Hitler and the Jewish slave labor camps, had turned Jewish Holocaust victims into victimizers. Imprisoned inside barbed wire refugee camps, the Palestinians began to resemble the victims of Nazi concentration camps. According to author Simon Schama, the Rothschilds own 80% of the land of Israel. Even the flag of Israel flies the hexagram symbol from the Rothschild family's red shield. The hexagram has 6 points, 6 triangles, and 6 sides on the central hexagram. The numbers 666 are associated with the biblical prophecies that predict an apocalyptic Third World War. In their national bestseller, Secret War Against the Jews, authors Loftus and Ahrens reveal indisputable evidence that Hitler's top Nazi general, General Reinhard Gehlen, transferred his entire network of Nazi spies and double agents to Fort Hunt, Virginia, to join America's newly formed CIA. This highly secretive operation was codenamed Operation Paperclip and included Holocaust mastermind Otto Skorzeny, Hitler's personal friend and favorite SS colonel. Since its illegitimate birth at the close of World War II, the CIA has always represented the interests of the banksters, not the American people. Nelson Rockefeller, who became U.S. Vice President, and Allen Dulles, who became CIA Director, Since its illegitimate birth at the close of World War II, the CIA has always represented the interests of the banksters, not the American people. Nelson Rockefeller, who became U.S. Vice President, and Allen Dulles, who became CIA Director, erased the Nazi pasts of hundreds of Nazi spies and scientists who they smuggled into the United States. Others were smuggled into Canada and South America along Rockefeller's rat line, using Vatican passports and money. Rockefeller was also guilty of supplying South American oil to Nazi subs that sunk American ships and killed American servicemen. The Jewish Zionists spied on Rockefeller's treasonous activities and then blackmailed him. In exchange for Jewish silence, Rockefeller agreed to arrange for enough votes from Latin American nations to guarantee Israel's membership into the United Nations. The sad truth, say Loftus and Ahrens, is that the Jewish Zionists bought those extra votes with the blood of millions of Jewish Holocaust victims. Christopher Simpson's book called Blowback exposes recently declassified information on America's recruitment of Nazi war criminals into the CIA. Nazi rocket scientist Werner von Braun, who built German rockets and dropped them on London, was also put on the new CIA payroll. Von Braun and his team of Nazi rocketeers were sent to Huntsville, Alabama. Hollywood honored von Braun as a collaborator on an American sci-fi movie and series of Walt Disney shows.
Let's take you back to 1958, 59, and I'm suddenly required to work with a Nazi. I grew up in World War II. Now, you couldn't expect me to suddenly have a great love for somebody that came out of Petermundy and was firing rockets at the people in England and blowing them up. And furthermore, had been in Petermundy where he had slave labor, etc. So how am I supposed to suddenly like that guy?
The international banksters and the men who served them had won the American, Russian, and British versions of monopoly by seizing control of the Bank of England and the U.S. Federal Reserve, and by wiping out the Russian czars. But the ultimate goal of the banksters was to win the world game. Their devious game plan was to divide the world into two warring power blocks: the Western capitalist bloc, led by the United States, and the Eastern Communist Bloc, led by Russia. Their next move was to transfer atomic weapons secrets to their Russian Communist Bloc through Victor Rothschild, who was the ringleader in Britain's biggest communist spy scandal, and through J. Robert Oppenheimer, the Manhattan Project's leading atomic scientist.
In September 1949, the Soviet Union exploded its first A-bomb. America's monopoly on atomic weapons ended after only 4 years. Now, both superpowers had the means to destroy the world.
The next step was to stage a phony arms race and Cold War between their First World Capitalist Bloc and Second World Communist Bloc. Like sports teams, the U.S. and Russian superpowers needed recruits for their war games. So they forced new Third World members of the United Nations to choose sides. American Secretary of State John Foster Dulles warned Third World countries that you're either with us or you're against us. Korea and Vietnam were torn up like rags into half-communist, half-capitalist countries and became the playing field for phony war games between the bankster superpowers.
Marilyn Monroe in Korea, America's great sex symbol, innocent and alluring, caught in the blood and mud of the Korean War. To the battle-weary soldiers who gazed at her, she must have looked like an angel sent from heaven to ease the pain of fighting a God-forsaken war in a far-off land.
It's difficult and dangerous, but they're generally outnumbered. American sabers and British meteors are outfighting the MiGs.
The lives of 4 million Korean civilians and 33,000 American soldiers were sacrificed in the 1950 Korean War, bringing the banksters another step closer to world domination. Like Korea, Vietnam was split into North and South Vietnam and became their next target. In 1954, the U.S. military dropped millions of tons of bombs on undefended Vietnamese civilians and turned their lush green countryside into blood-red killing fields. It was a butcherous campaign of terror, rape, torture, lies, and cover-ups. The U.S. military, who had already tested 2 radioactive atomic weapons of mass destruction on the people of Japan, decided to test their chemical weapons of mass destruction on the people of Vietnam. Liters of chemical weapons of mass destruction were sprayed over the Vietnamese people, their water, and their countryside. The most lethal was Agent Orange, which defoliated, killed, and contaminated everything in its path like a radioactive atomic bomb. To this day, survivors suffer related cancers, genetic deformities, and permanent environmental damage. Many U.S. servicemen publicly confessed to their crimes and suffered haunting flashbacks. On May 4th, 1970, America got a wake-up call. 6 peaceful anti-war student demonstrators from Kent State and Jackson State universities were shot dead by U.S. armed guards, while dozens of others were wounded. The message came through loud and clear: the power of the U.S. military could turn its weapons on its own citizens. In 1947, the United States played host to an international conference at Bretton Woods to put an end to world poverty and starvation caused by World War II. The idea was to give humanitarian loans to needy nations by creating a World Bank and an International Monetary Fund. But who would be put in charge of these billion-dollar mega loans? Who else but the U.S. Federal Reserve bankster families? U.S. Federal Reserve banksters in charge of humanitarian loans is like putting pedophiles in charge of daycare centers. Instead of helping the poor, the banksters turned the World Bank and International Monetary Fund into international pawn shops and robbed the poor. Just to qualify for a loan, desperate nations were forced to pawn their mines, forests, railways, power companies, and water systems, and agree to over 100 loan conditions at loan shark interest rates. To pay off the loans, they were forced to ignore laws that protected their environment, to lower wages, and to cut back on their education and on their health care. They were also forced to privatize and sell off their resources to crooked corporations like Enron. The Federal Reserve banksters in charge of humanitarian loans is like putting pedophiles in charge of daycare centers. Instead of helping the poor, the banksters turned the World Bank and International Monetary Fund into international pawn shops and robbed the poor. Just to qualify for a loan, desperate nations were forced to pawn their mines, forests, railways, power companies, and water systems, and agree to over 100 loan conditions at loan shark interest rates. To pay off the loans, they were forced to ignore laws that protected their environment, to lower wages, and to cut back on their education and on their health care. They were also forced to privatize and sell off their resources to crooked corporations like Enron. Lord Wakeham, the director of N.M. Rothschild & Sons, was on the audit committee of Enron and cooked the books and sucked billions from pension funds and investors before declaring bankruptcy. When poor nations were unable to pay their loans, they were given new loans to pay off the old loans. But these so-called bailout loans weren't about bailing out the poor. They were about bailing out and lining the pockets of loan underwriters like Citigroup and America's most notorious crooks and banksters. As desperately poor nations got more desperately poor, the filthy rich banksters got filthier rich, and God help anybody who got in their way. Davison Buddu, senior economist for the International Monetary Fund, resigned to, quote, "wash my hands of the blood of millions of poor and starving people." When President John F. Kennedy tried to take back America by reviving U.S. government printed money, his head was blown off in a Dallas motorcade. When his son planned to expose the ugly truth about his father's assassination, his small plane plunged into the ocean, killing all on board.